The UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, where the UCLA campus lies today. We also recognize that the UCLA Lake Arrowhead Conference Center sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, the Uhaviatam people. We would like to thank the sponsors of the 2020 UCLA Arrowhead Symposium online series. Their support enables us to bring you today's program. This session is brought to you by Arup. This is an interactive session. To participate in this session, use Zoom's built-in chat, Q&A, and raise hand features.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session, Advancing Equity Through Agency Actions. My name is Jacob Wasserman. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm a research project manager here at the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. I'll be the moderator for this session, and thank you all so much for joining us. So just for a little background, at earlier sessions of the Arrowhead Symposium last week, we heard from an amazing panel moderated by Charles Brown and Tamika Butler on the limits of Black mobility, both in terms of getting around in daily life and in the world of transportation policy, planning, and practice. We learned from Dr. Evelyn Blumenberg, Dr. Catherine Chen, and Stephen Wong on some of the many mobility challenges of vulnerable populations during the pandemic. And this morning, we heard from Dr. Destiny Thomas, Rio Oshas, and Naomi Dorner on building co-powerment and incorporating reparative planning into practice. These are fantastic conversations, and if you haven't had a chance to listen to them, I highly recommend viewing them on the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies YouTube channel after this session. So with those conversations as context, we have a sense of the past and present challenges and opportunities to making mobility more equitable. This session will now turn toward ways to achieve those equity goals. What is the role of transportation agencies in pursuit of equity and justice? How can we make change through the public sector? And what role can and do transportation agencies and departments in particular have in equity work? Our three panelists today all do tremendous work at public transportation agencies or work closely with them, and I'm very excited to hear their perspectives. Just a few logistical notes. This is an interactive session, so if you're listening on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature throughout to submit questions. And you can use the Zoom chat to talk with other folks here today. Note that you should send your chats to all panelists and attendees to make sure everybody sees it. And as the speakers introduce themselves, please feel free to introduce yourself in the Zoom chat as well. And we're going to be having a breakout session afterwards for discussion, so stay tuned for that. So with that, let's get to the discussion. If our panelists could turn on their cameras. Great. So first speaker I'd like to introduce is Jamario Jackson. Jamario. Great. He's a senior community planner at Transform, which is a mobility nonprofit that does work across the West Coast. Before that, he worked in the California State Assembly and U.S. Senate offices, and for AC Transit, which is the bus system in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area. So we'll just start off by having Jamario say a few words about what led you to the work you're doing today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, UCLA. Hello to the fellow panelists and our ASL interpreter. I think for me, I can answer this question very quickly and I can move out of the way because it's pretty simple for me. I wanted to come into this space of planning because I wanted to not only study something in school and commit my public service to, but something that was geared towards solving problems and solving interdisciplinary problems as well. So in the planning space, we recognize that there are issues that I particularly identify with as being interdisciplinary, and also understanding that the solutions are also interdisciplinary as well. And so for me, it was about finding a space where I could work and thrive that was honoring my lived experience and having to be okay with me wanting to get into a job field where I brought my lived experience to that work. And so I'm excited to be in this kind of space and during this particular time. And so for me, it's just about committing myself to the public service of the work that I've done. And so thankfully, I've been able to work for elected officials, spend some time at a transit agency to better understand the political that goes into these decisions and how our environments are created. And then the work that I'm doing now at Transform is more so based on programs and even more specific to building relationships in community as it relates, it maybe even doesn't relate to projects that we are trying to deliver upon, but focusing the work on relationship building.
Great, thank you so much. Our next panelist is Keandra Kaiwer Dodds, who's the Executive Officer of Equity and Race at Los Angeles Metro, which is the public transit agency for Los Angeles County. Before that, she was the Manager of Preservation at the Community Development Corporation of Los Angeles County, and has a wealth of experience in transportation, affordable housing, policy advocacy, and the law. So the same question to you. What led you to the work you're doing today?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So I lead our equity work at Metro currently, and I think in many ways, this work, for me, I'm coming back full circle. I started doing a lot of DEI work really when I was in college, whether it was, pushing for diversity and inclusion training in our athletic department, or, working on trainings around interdisciplinary issues for people of color and transgender individuals. So a lot of that work, coupled with the fact that I was also studying urban studies and really looking at and trying to understand the built environment. And I really, I think my passion for social justice was both in looking for ways to empower the communities with which I identify, but also finding ways to fight for their rights. And so a lot of that experience really led me to law school. And then, from there, through my first job at a public interest law firm, I focused on affordable housing. And throughout that experience, I, kind of moved into public service. And also at a nonprofit. And through each of those positions, there was kind of consistent themes. I was always either working on housing or transportation or both. There was always this connection between the two. And I really come to understand those two critical, those two components, both housing and transportation, as key components to really improving access and success in life for people. And so even in this role at Metro, I think the lens through which I focus on our work and how we advance equity is, one, understanding our role in a broader land use context, but also centering and prioritizing the needs of marginalized and vulnerable populations. And so, yeah, it's exciting to be back in this, working in this role, in this new capacity with that experience. And then just a little bit about Metro. So Metro's unique as a transportation agency. We serve as both a planner, a coordinator, a designer, a builder, and an operator in the county of LA. And so it's really exciting because there's a lot of opportunity within our agency to lead in this work, but also to partner. We have a huge role with the rest of the county. And I think that also supports, why I started doing this work, because of the potential to be able to have a greater change and impact. So that's it.
Great. And our last panelist today is the Honorable Lateefah Simon. Director Simon is the president of the Bay Area Rapid Transit Board, the BART Board, which is the regional subway in the San Francisco Bay Area. Somehow also finds time to be president of Oakland's Akanati Foundation, a trustee of the California State University, and won a MacArthur Genius Fellowship for her work with the Center for Young Women's Development. For full disclosure, and because I'm quite proud of it, I used to work for Director Simon on the BART board. So Lateefah, same question. What led you to the work you're doing today?
Well, I think for full disclosure, you probably made $100 per quarter as a fellow with me. So I want to thank you for your love and your service. I love the question, and I love these two panelists. And I'm a little bit nervous. If you read their bios, they are extremely brilliant and have put so much love and heart into transportation and mobility justice. And so I'm really glad to be honored to be in company with you all. I, like my colleagues in this conversation, came to the work, and I will mirror some of your remarks, because I understand that systems are often designed and built and led by folks who have good intentions. However, folks who are deeply on the margins and who deeply rely and are deserving of good systems, those voices are typically never centered. And I had been doing criminal and juvenile justice, police reform advocacy for upwards of 20 years, and leading organizations, both grassroots and venerable, in the Bay Area. And frankly, Jacob, my story. My husband passed away from cancer, and one of the last things we had left after bankruptcy was his car. I'd never driven a car. And I'm legally blind and had keys and like a $2,000 car, and we sold it. I had these two babies, two children, and it became clear to me that the voices of single mothers, of workers, of disabled people, of activists and organizers, of folks who felt the brunt of bad systems, those voices weren't screaming from the mountaintops about transportation access. And here I found myself back on full-time public transportation with grocery bags and a couple of very intense jobs and daycare, and realized that the best way that I really could be accountable to the community that had held us down in some very deep times was to go directly into a system that was going to be impacting me for the rest of my life. And I don't think I could have made a better choice. And I'm looking forward to talking more about that in this conversation. So thank you for having me.
Great. Yeah, I'm really excited to have you through here in conversation. So I guess I just wanted to start off first. We unfortunately hear so many examples of transportation agencies and governments, failing to do the right thing consistently, past and present. But for this panel, I want to highlight some successes that you each have had in your work, in work you've done either now or in the past. What have you seen that works? And I guess in answering that, maybe for folks in the audience who also work at a public agency or are activists looking to move public agencies, what lessons can they take from the work you've done? And I'll start with Keandra.
All right. So I guess when I saw this question, my first thought was, okay, we have a couple different examples at more of a micro level. We have, there was one project where we did a first last mile plan for one of our oldest lines on our system. And we went through this process of true partnership and engagement with CBOs. We actually, for the first time, hired a group of CBOs to partner with us to do the community engagement and then also help us to write the plan. They selected someone who would actually write parts of the plan. And through that process, we built relationships, we built trust in the work and also in the partnership with Metro. And then we also included things that we had never done before, like a redlining map to show the context of which this project was being developed in and the history of that community. And it was a very successful process, and we're trying to formalize that. We learned a lot of lessons from that about our procurement process, about how to make it easier to partner with CBOs, how to train our staff to work better with CBOs. And I think why it was successful was because it was a true partnership. It had its bumps along the way, but we adjusted and worked to build something that a process that could work better. And I think, our goal right now is to formalize that, to find ways to model, to improve that model and to do it with more projects. And I think, another example, just briefly, is our next gen planning process. So we have a new plan for our bus system, which from the start involved a lot of engagement with a large group of stakeholders. I actually was one. This is before I worked at Metro. I was still a nonprofit. But throughout the process, we engaged with these stakeholders with a variety of different perspectives, different interests and groups that we were working with. And then also really try to figure out, how do we prioritize equity? What does that look like, both in the community engagement, but also in the data that we're looking at? And so it was one example where, we started off with a definition for high need communities based on income, race, and lack of car ownership, but we went even deeper to try and understand need and high propensity to use transit. And so we incorporated that as we were, selecting the changes to make in our services. But I think the last thing that I'll mention is just that I do want to also recognize that, so my office is new. I joined our agency in January, and a lot of the other macro level things and other major projects that we're working on, we're starting, and it takes time, and it's a process. And so for, other agencies that are looking to do this work and are kind of earlier on in the process, I just want to, I guess, note that it's really important to put in the time and the work. And, there are some things that you may see changes right away, but you'll have more sustainable long-term changes if you put in the time and put in the work. For example, we created a tool called our Rapid Equity Assessment to help us as we're looking during COVID and during just the fast changing times that were happening over this last year. And it had specific questions about, who would benefit from this action, who would be burdened, and how to maximize benefit for marginalized populations, and others more likely to be impacted by COVID. But what was important is that you can't just give a tool to people without the training and the education, because it could be used in a more detrimental way if you do that. So you can, it's important to try and figure out what can you do quickly. And I think it's a tough question, first, depending on the project, but also you have to put in the work, the education, to be able to build the capacity to actually, for staff to be able to do this work and move in a meaningful, sustainable way. So yeah, those are just a few thoughts there.
Jamario.
Yeah, for me, I want to just ground us really quickly in agency, because as I was preparing for this panel, I was like, how do I fit in with agency and all this stuff? Because I work for a nonprofit. I think we ironed it out in our prep meeting, but I think for those watching, I think it's important to also, just call out the fact that agency for me, right? And my response to this question is two things. It's the agency in terms of who's the governing body. So whether that's a transportation agency, a city council, they have decision-making power in regards to agency. And then secondly, agency, I'm looking at it as the individual's responsibility in terms of the power that they have to make decisions. And so if we recognize those two things, we can also sort of accept the fact that you could work for an agency that might be causing a lot of harm, but within your scope and within your project management, you might be able to have a lot of different successes and wins and partnerships with the community. So recognizing that, I want to turn to, I think, some internal examples at Transform, not project specific, but like for the internal work, what Keandra was alluding to as well. For us, COVID-19, like many others, has created a lot of different shifts in the work. And so thankfully, I work for an organization that's willing to have the conversations, that are willing to explore other possibilities. And so for us, we've been able to, in our contracts with government, the city of Oakland, for example, and even some of our other funders, but to have the conversation of how can we adjust this budget given the circumstances of COVID-19? How can we adjust and accommodate and shift the work of what we thought was public engagement that now needs to attend to other needs? For Transformers, for our work, it's all about addressing the need. And so if we know the need is changing due to COVID-19, then that means, we got to show up to the work a little bit differently. So it's been very helpful to be in conversation with folks that are able to be flexible and make certain shifts. And so where we thought we might not have been able to have certain engagements, whether they be in person or getting feedback surveys, we found ways to do that via online. And we already know doing things online is also somewhat of a barrier, but I think in certain cases, we're finding ways to eliminate that as barriers. And so there are teams at Transform that have found ways to provide childcare online simultaneously while they're having a community engagement event. And so there's all these different examples, but I think the takeaway here for us in my response to this question is the internal work that has to happen. We're not the best at it at Transform, but I think we're pretty good and we're getting better and we're set on doing the best that we can at all times. And so it's important to listen to what's happening internally to be able to respond to your projects externally as well.
Great, and turn to Latifa.
I love Transform. I really do. And if folks don't, well, most of the folks in the audience know about Transform. And I'm so happy that you're there. It's an amazing institution that's extremely thoughtful about how to address so many of the wicked problems that, especially in places like the Bay Area, where we have 27 providers, operators. And, you know, while we're all doing such great planning as a sector, you know, right now, somewhere in the Bay Area, somewhere in Los Angeles, you know, there is an elderly woman with grocery bags for dinner waiting for 45 minutes for a vehicle to arrive. And I can go on. And so I just thank you all for the work that you're doing. You know, this question is a hard one, Jacob, because, you know, as someone who's, you know, worked for an elected and also, you know, Keandra, you've worked for electeds as well. I am not, because I'm sure some of the staff from BART are on the phone, I'm not going to take credit for anything, because the reality is, I'm going to name a couple things, but the reality is at BART, we have an Office of Civil Rights. It's very thoughtful about our contracting, hence 209. We have an amazing Office of Communications who's thinking every single day about how we translate what we're doing to real folks like my mom, who is also transit dependent, and the shifts and changes pre and post COVID. And, you know, I think about our performance and budget staff, who is not emotional in any way. They use data to guide every single decision that we make, from service provision, you know, to proposals around fare and inflation increases. And then I also think about the amazing folks who, if they don't come to work, nothing gets done. And those are the planners. So what I'm about to talk about, I'm about to give you a few things that I'm really proud of from a policy perspective that I've been a part of and have hopefully helped to advance, but in no way in any transit institution, which in itself is a huge ecosystem, do you get anything done without moving through the layers and the levers of these great institutions. And it is oftentimes, it is the planners, it's the folks behind budget, it is the folks you know, in graphics and in communications who really never you know, get the clout that they deserve for really advancing real work. So just a couple things that I want to lift up, and we can talk about it, the policing stuff a little later. But, you know, Jacob, you might have remembered, you know, in the first few months of my election, and BART is one of 3 transportation systems in the country that has an elected board. It's not like a regular thing. Most transit institutions have appointed boards of directors. We have to run for our seats. And I represent 19 cities here in San Francisco, up to the East Bay, past Berkeley and Richmond, ending in a small town right over the Richmond refinery, but we'll go into that later. But, you know, we authored something called co-authored something called the Sanctuary Policy for Bay Area Rapid Transit. And it was successful in terms of the board members voting for it, 8-1. And sanctuary policy for me, when I came in, understanding, and I'm not apolitical, so I'm going to talk in some platitudes here. When the current administration stuck its knee sort of in the backs of Americans and saying that they were going to go full throttle on deportations, you know, transportation is in mobility. It must be looked at as a right and not a privilege. And so BART has its own police force, and throughout the country, the administration was pushing ICE raids into public spaces and we believed, and I believe that that couldn't happen on Bay Area Rapid Transit. And so we passed a policy, the first in the country, the nation of its kind, that said that our employees, their labor could not be commandeered by federal staff. And I was really proud of that for a number of reasons, is that the folks who rely on public transit every single day in the Bay Area, they're the backbone of our economy, and many of those folks don't have papers. The one place that they shouldn't be afraid to move in is in our system, as folks are trying desperately to achieve citizenship, that we are all one Bay Area family. And that particular assault, I wanted to make sure that our institution made it very, very clear where we stood. The other thing that I just want to lift up, and we can talk about ambassadors later, is the idea that transportation, again, is, while folks will say it's cheaper than riding a car, and in spaces like Los Angeles proper and in San Francisco and Oakland, we know that low income and Black and brown and disabled people are living farther and farther away from the urban core. And with Bay Area Rapid Transit, the farther you live, the more you pay, unlike MTA in New York and other places around the country. And so being able to work with our staff, our board, members of the MTC to advance a means-based fare pilot. We, even during COVID, we have launched that pilot. So folks who are, for instance, SNAP eligible or who live in low-income housing are able to take advantage of a 20% decrease. It's not enough, but it is hopefully, again, a push in the right direction that says everyone should be able to ride. The last thing I'll say on that, in terms of sort of policy responses, thinking about why we must be in the room at all times when decisions are being made about transit, especially for riders. When I came on the BART board and when I was running, I was really honest that as a teenager, I fare evaded almost daily, not because I wanted to be a criminal, but because I was a young person who had an internship 30 miles away from my house. And I was raised in low-income housing, and I had a mother who gave everything that she could, and a BART ticket with an adult fare price was too much. Up until 2 years ago, if you were over the age of 11 years old, you had to pay full adult price for BART. What we know when we look at particular policies is we know that those policies weren't developed by the single mother, by the disabled man, by someone who is coming home for prison or jail, or students. And so being able to be in a situation to lift up those inequities and advance them, we were able to extend the youth fare to 18. There's a number of other things that we've been able to do, and it's not quick, and it's certainly not easy, but we're getting there. We're getting there.
So on that point, BART has a police force. A lot of transit agencies either have their own police force or contract with one. And I guess I'm wondering, this is a big question, but how do we disentangle transportation and mobility from policing, from incarceration? Right as we're speaking now, the Los Angeles City Council, for those here, is considering recriminalizing homelessness on sidewalks and freeways near public rights of way. So this is not an issue that is something in the past that has gone away. It's happening right now. So I guess I'll go back to Latifa, and then the others can jump in. I know BART has an ambassador program. What are the first steps here to separating policing from transportation?
Well, Jacob, I should ask you, because remember we developed some of those, we brainstormed about how the program would work. Now I ran on this idea again, but needed, and thank God had other board members like Bevan Dufty, who's just a champion for all things equity and civil rights. He's another board member, but over 25 years of elected experience. It's good to have ideas, but again, if you don't have board members who can move things along for you and with you, or staff who's willing to deeply dig in, nothing happens. They're just North Stars. It was clear after the murder of Oscar Grant, and even with all of the amazing reforms that BART had launched, we were one of the first agencies in the country to to require body cameras. We have our own independent police auditor, and he has staff. We have what's like a police commission or an oversight board. The chiefs, there's been 3 chiefs since the murder of Oscar Grant, have been very focused on training, but we also know that it's not enough, right? It's not enough. And that safety is what's so important. When we think about safety, we have committed ourselves as a culture and a nation to think safety, police, armed police. Well, and I want to say, Jacob, my background, I've worked with domestic abuse survivors. I've worked with trafficked young women. I've buried a lot of young people, and I deeply believe in accountability. And I do have very clear around the world, you see police. In introducing the idea of ambassadors, was extremely clear that BART needed a holistic force of staff who are thinking about safety and security and infrastructure and wayfinding and lighting. And I can go on and on, all of the things that make folks safe, that safety could not and will not be, and has never been actualized by simply just having folks with badges and guns. And so us saying that, again, if you're homeless, if you're having the worst day of your life, if you're dealing with a mental health crisis and you find your way into the tunnels because cities and counties don't have treatment on demand, cities and counties don't have shelter, especially now during COVID, you're kicked out at 7:30. Where do you go? You go to the buses or the tunnels, right? I know I would, right? Where would I be? Where would I go? So for us, advancing an ambassador model, again, it's a lighter touch. You need eyes and ears. I always think of the hall monitor in high school. I'm kind of not going to cut if I see Mr. Jenkins down the hall. But if I don't, people need to see people. And the ambassador idea, again, is hiring folks from the community and training them in de-escalation, and having them have access and referrals, again, not in place of police officers, but definitely lifting up a system that prides itself on wanting to make sure, whether you're a destinationless passenger or a passenger, you're treated with dignity and respect. And there is violent crime in any public system, including our transportation systems. So it would make sense that the folks who are most trained and skilled to deal with deep deferral, a deep prevention and investigation, focus on that. Homeless brothers and sisters and folks who have addiction issues should be, in fact, guided to places to support them. You throw somebody off of a train, and without addressing the root cause of the problem, they get right back on. What we want is for all of our citizens, all of our residents, all of our riders to be able to have the most human-like experience. And that doesn't mean throwing people away. I think that the commitment for us to be pragmatic, but extremely impatient with the ways in which public systems treat poor people and Black people, and figuring out, while again, we have to be pragmatic. I wanted to bring the ambassadors year 1, Jacob, and didn't realize it was going to be a 3-year union fight with all the unions, not just the police union. But we are in a place where we have now made that program permanent, but we're not done. We need to bring on social work specialists, because again, we need network weavers throughout our 100 miles of folks. Transportation institutions are supposed to deal with people, and not just people with good jobs, right? And not just people who are going to be a part of sort of a civic experience in the morning. There are people, whether we're uncomfortable with them or not because of their presentation and their space in life, but they are owed the respect and the navigation that their working, wealthy, middle-class, white counterpart would get. And that's when we talk about mobility, justice, and access. That's really the vision. And policing should not be the first and the last vision for how we keep riders safe. I have more uniformed police officers and safety staff right now than ever in the history of Bay Area rapid transit. And it's still not enough. No, what's not enough is for us to be a one-trick pony. We have to really be thoughtful with how people experience safety in our system.
Keandra, how is this playing out at LA Metro, rethinking public safety, rethinking the role of police in public transit?
Yes. So I was actually really excited to be on this panel with Latifa for one of many reasons. This is one, because I wanted to learn more about the experience in BART. We're in the early phases of our work around reimagining public safety. We're developing a public safety advisory committee that will work with closely as we enter this process. We have kind of different contracts that help us collectively address safety and security right now. One of those being a 3-party contract with 3 of the largest law enforcement agencies in LA County. So our sheriffs, LAPD and Long Beach PD. But, you know, part of our work is really focusing on what does it mean to keep people safe? What does safety mean for different folks? And what does that look like? And similarly, you know, we've had a large focus on increasing our policing. And more recently, we've started really shifting our approach to how we work with people who are unhoused on our system. We have had some really successful partnerships with nonprofits that specialize in providing services and housing for the unhoused, and have, especially during COVID, actually been able to get over 600 people into housing that were on our system. So that's a really exciting model that we want to expand and build upon, because there's much more to do, but also figure out how do we better partner with the broader county agencies that are doing this work. You know, we are a transportation agency in that this is not an area where we specialize. It's also, you know, not the purpose of our safety and security team is also not focusing on addressing homelessness. Their specialties is not within that area. And so it's really incumbent upon us to bring in the experts that, you know, do work in this space and figure out how we better partner with them. I think the only other thing that I'll add at this point is that, you know, this will be I think this will be a challenge for us, because I think, you know, within public agencies, and this is kind of getting into one of the later questions, but one of the challenges is similar to what Latifah mentioned. We have a certain way that we think about safety and security. And so really pushing ourselves to expand that, and really working to come to this table, both as an agency, but also within all of the PSAC, the Public Safety Advisory Committee members, finding ways to really level set so that we're all on the same page as far as like the data that exists, the problem we're trying to solve, that we're able to build that trust and that communication within this committee so that we can come up with solutions that really work for all of us. And then I think just the last piece is also, in addition to how we think about safety, really specifically how we think about homelessness and people that are unhoused, and really focusing on behaviors and not people. That's really critical, because I think no matter our conversations, you know, our community, our surveys that we get from riders, the feedback we get from some of our bus drivers, homelessness has increased on our system. And we know that, and we know that, you know, for some people, they feel uncomfortable by the presence, but that doesn't mean that it's illegal or wrong for a person that is homeless to be on our system. And so figuring out how do we address, again, behaviors instead of people, and be part of the solution so that people don't have to live on our system, don't have to seek shelter in our system, but also addressing behaviors that are problematic, is going to be key for us as we're moving forward. So there's a lot there, but I am excited that we're you know, taking this approach and hopeful in the outcomes and different solutions that will come from it.
Yeah, thanks so much. And just a little plug, we're doing research here at UCLA on transit agencies and homelessness and their response during the pandemic. So stay tuned. We'll have something report later in the year on that. Jamario, from your perspective at Transform, what does this conversation about reimagining public safety, thinking about how it interacts with mobility, how does that play out in your work?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe this is because I live in Oakland, but for us, there's nothing to imagine, because the Black Panthers already taught us that we could secure our own communities. And so I happen to, you know, work very frequently in the community of East Oakland. And I've been to 2 different, I guess, activations, we could call them. One was like a social justice protest in response to police brutality more generally. And so that was an East Oakland Rising event, as well as the Black Cultural Zone out here in East Oakland has land of their own that they own. They own it, they own it, they own it. And they're occupying it the way that they need to occupy it to meet the needs of the community. And it's so beautiful. And in both of those spaces, both the march that I attended in East Oakland and the Black Cultural Zone space, I got to see, and this wasn't the only example of it, but you saw the community securing their own environment. There are organizations here in Oakland that provide that safety and that security, and they look like me. And they look like the other panelists. And so there are models out there that are already existing and thriving that don't mimic what our current law enforcement system produces. And so I think in my actual work, from a more planning perspective, is that we know that police officers go through what's called peace officer training. That's essentially their like licensing and education at the most basic level from the state, at least within California, this is how it works. And so once they get that training, they then can shop around to other places that might, acknowledge that license and allow them to put in an application and work there and likely go through more training. And so I bring that up because one, it's political in nature because the state has an obligation and a responsibility to sort of facilitate that type of transaction, but then also to call out the relationship in which we've placed law enforcement on our other interagency issues. So for example, maybe it was a couple months ago, but it was definitely during COVID, I attended a bicycle advisory committee meeting for the city of Oakland. And they were giving this presentation that used data from law enforcement. And what became very evident is one, the data is almost unusable because the way they code things and the way they term certain things, whether those be tickets or certain behaviors that are happening in the street, you really can't translate it into a useful way to advance your planning project or to better understand what really happened, right? And so law enforcement is held with such high regard that it's hard to tap into and even use their, I guess, participation in society as like a resource. It's a very challenging relationship as an African-American male to work in a space that relies on engagement with law enforcement. And so for me, the relationship is very critical to call out because aside from all the training, aside from how they get their licensing, what kind of relationship do we want to have with the existing system? Likely none at all, right? And so if that's the case, how can we produce a newer model of doing that, or at least duplicate it, right? And we're seeing it happen in East Oakland. We're seeing it happen in many different places of color where we can police, or not even police, secure our own communities to make sure that we're protected. And a lot of it is really cool in the sense that, again, agency, it comes back to that personal responsibility of the individual. It is so comforting for me to walk around my neighborhood, to be in Oakland at times, and to know that there's other Black people looking out for me, that are checking on me, that are saying what's up, that are making eye contact with me. And that's really where the foundation of that relationship building starts, because if we know each other in our community, then we know how we get down. I had a professor of mine in grad school who, to sum it up very quickly, always made clear to us that there were many different examples in when our country was segregated by race, where we were actually thriving at our best during those times because we knew who each other were, we knew who our community was, and we had a greater sense of our own identity. And so now that we've spread out, we've moved to all these different places, we work in all these different places, you could work somewhere and not even understand who you're working with or that type of environment. Oftentimes we don't face that reality until we move somewhere new or change jobs to where we try to get more familiar with somewhere. But it's very important for us to know where we are and to ground ourselves in that particular way of thinking.
Jay, I think that's right. And you actually, while you were talking, I'm butting in, I know this is off agenda.
Please.
You inspired me to think about you're talking about the town in Oakland is just such a place of pride and clarity, and that folks who've had very little have been the best planners for their own safety. And I wanted to lift up the Alliance for Girls. It's an amazing institution in Oakland, led for and by girls. And they did a fantastic research project. And I know Jacob shaking his head that you've looked at it, but what they came to Bay Area Rapid Transit after researching and literally surveying thousands of girls of color, trans women, gender nonconforming folk, young people in the Bay to amplify, actually safety is an issue. Like, I think what we're talking about, what's important is not to not realize that, folks, we are burying folks. During COVID, the stressors are violence is increasing in homes and in communities. Like, in no way, and I will out myself as a victim of violent crime 20 years ago, very violent crime. There's no way that I want to overshadow the realities of folks not being safe in community. And I think it's important to say that we have to figure out root causes, even as transit folks, right, to these issues. For what these young women are saying is, it's not just when I'm on the train at night, it's when I get off and I'm waiting at the bus stop and there's no lights and my mom is coming to pick me up. What they're purporting is, if we can get safety right for the 16-year-old trans young woman, it's good for everybody else, right? If we can ensure, that the young girls going out to a softball game on Sunday and they're being sexually harassed and there's somebody somewhere who will react and see them as human, then safety is then better and more achieved for everyone. I think when we're talking about holistic responses to safety, thinking how policing is done, if at all possible, more equitable, and folks are using their skills for what they need to be used for, and us thinking about better ways to staff and increase the staffing of our safety ecosystems, it is not without saying that these issues are real. Right. However, if you look at BART stats, what people are most afraid of is they're afraid of being in proximity with someone who's unhoused or someone who's not having a good mental health day. And absolutely, on any bus system that you're on, and I've ridden many of them throughout my life throughout the country, you're in a public space. And when public actors, when there are no mental health services, and when jails are used as mental health systems, and when folks don't have housing, we on transportation as sort of moving cities, we see those realities as well. We are not exempt from system failure to deal with racism and poverty and the lack of services. So they're in these conversations where we're talking about dismantling or shifting carceral structures. It is not without to say that folks in our communities are definitely in need of support and accountability, but that accountability structure as it exists, it hasn't done its job.
So I want to jump off that, but I have a quick question, but then we can move to questions from the audience. So be sure to use the Q&A feature to submit and vote on what other people have said. On the point you raised, Mario, on needing to have these relationships that may not exist already, could you talk a little more about the model you use at Transform, and maybe Keandra can also talk about the model that some of your projects have used at Metro. It's not the meeting at noon on a work day that it used to be. What can transit agencies do to really make the kind of engagement and co-empowerment we talked about in the morning session happen?
Yeah, for us, it happens in a variety of different ways. Luckily for me, so I'm gonna call them a couple different examples. So I work on a team that we call ourselves Disrupting Inequity. And so we initially set out to focus on work with micromobility companies and figuring out what to do with this thing called active transportation. And so I find myself in a space working a lot on issues in regards to maybe bicycling and scootering, but also just physical mobility and being able to walk places. So the work that we do, and going back to my intro comments about this interdisciplinary way of addressing challenges and issues, to do that, we contract with community. And because it's not easy to be a small business or a nonprofit out here, I work with smaller organizations that are really on the ground administering services, right? Doing things that our government is often supposed to do. And so I work with the Scraper Bike team very closely. I work with East Oakland Collective very closely. And they're smaller organizations, but they're very, very mighty. And they're very interdisciplinary because they're just looking to, at the end of the day, meet people's needs and help people out. And so we know that because a smaller organization maybe doesn't have the bandwidth or the capacity or haven't demonstrated that they could handle a $2 million budget, that they're not, the system and the application criteria doesn't naturally invite them to apply for certain grants or projects. And so because of those challenges within the process itself, we're able to serve as what we're calling a pass-through to those organizations. So Transform shows up on the application as prime or as lead, and we're able to then subcontract out a lot of the other work to deliver the project or the plan or whatever it might be. And so we've been doing that for quite a while, and I've only been at Transform for a year and a half. And so in our contracting with City of Oakland, we see that example duplicating itself as well. I've done smaller research sprints, if you will, and we've been able to institute this really cool thing where we're providing community, I guess, thought leadership, you could call it, by creating space for, why am I blanking on the word? Advisors, community advisors. And so sometimes for projects we've sought after subject matter experts like Dr. Destiny Thomas. And then in other times, we really wanted to make sure we had representation from all different parts of California, even though the project or the idea is pertaining to the San Francisco Bay Area. So we're really trying to cast this wider net of expanding our network and inviting more folks to the table and to the conversation that wouldn't quite normally be there. And the part that I live and breathe every day is also finding a way to get some of these smaller organizations or even individuals in a place where they're the Transform, right? Where they're the prime, where they're the lead applicant, and it's not Transform. Because what we want to provide these organizations and community in general is the ownership. We want to see that vision realized day after day. We want to make sure that they're making decisions for their community and that they don't have to even compete for government funding, because we're finding ways to provide those dollars and to find that revenue as well. So it's a lot that's on our plate that we're working with, but the takeaways and the model that we have is to institute community advisors where possible, subcontract out as much work as possible to community, so that they're leading the work in their own neighborhoods, right? Those are the two main things that we do as a constant, and that's specific to my team. We have many other teams that Transform, but that's some of the work that we do.
Great. In the interest of time, I'm going to move to some audience questions now. So Maddie Brosen at the UCLA Lewis Center will queue up our first questioner.
Great. Thanks, Jacob. And thank you all for this amazing conversation. I think it's been hard to think of questions because we all just want to kind of learn from everything you're saying already. But our first question is from Will Bumgardner, who's with Arup in San Francisco.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much to the panelists. This is really enlightening and inspiring. And for those of us that work, I'm a consultant. I work for transit agencies a lot, and I just asking for your own opinions of how would you prioritize actions for transit systems to more equitably serve communities? There's a lot we can do. Obviously, we need to work on many fronts, transit service structure, timing, fare policy, the built environment, passenger experience. But where can we have the biggest impact the fastest?
I appreciate, I'll be quick because I actually want to hear from Keandra, and your position is inspiring in so many ways. And it should not just be one person, this idea, and I know it's not at your agency, but again, if you are in a metropolitan or, metro or in a rural space, you think about who you serve, those are your customers. And unfortunately, We are now just beginning in our sector to prioritize the languages, the voices, the experiences, and the cultural norms of our customers. So I'm looking forward to having more conversations with you, Keandra. I'm like, slide that job description into the chat so we can all really learn from you. I would actually love at some point to just, using this platform or others, to hear about, one, how your position was funded, how they found you, and really, what the work plan of somebody focused on race and equity looks like in a transportation system writ large. Like, that is your job. That is amazing. And I think that BART and other transportation agencies can really learn how to use staff requisitions to focus on, for many reasons, addressing your question, but to be good to our customers, to be able to see them and develop opportunity and modeling and products for them as we need them on our systems to survive.
Yeah, tough question. And it's funny that you mentioned the staff, because right now I am a staff of one, but I'm hiring 3 positions right now. So, just I guess a little bit of background. The basis of our work is our equity platform, and that's something that was passed by our board back in 2018. And it's focused on improving access to opportunity, recognizing that there are barriers and gaps in people's ability to access certain opportunities. We're talking jobs, housing, et cetera. And so the purpose is really to understand what those disparities are, the root causes, and then figure out how do we address them through our work. And so again, that was back in 2008. Since then, there's been, different projects where we've tried to, one, highlight how do we define high need communities? And again, that when I mentioned earlier, the equity focused communities, we're looking at race and income as well as car ownership, and really trying to understand what are the key determinants of social disparities, both in our region and more broadly, and how do we prioritize investments in those areas. But then also, we didn't have a definition until I started. So that was one of the first priorities for me, was defining equity and really pushing us to get away from, and it's a process, but really explain why we're focusing on equity as opposed to geographic equality. And that's a scary concept for some folks. We only more recently have even started focusing on equality. We have a whole historic, our past is we have different historic inequities, different ways that we've invested in communities across our region. And so equality was a newer thing, and now we're moving to equity, which the whole purpose is to take into account where people are starting from, what the actual need is. And so that's been part of my priority, is educating folks, like creating the definition, getting to a shared understanding of what that definition is, and now constantly reinforcing it so that it's, for everyone from our board on down, we're all on the same page about what that means. But then the next big step is, you're right, how do we operationalize that? And a lot of our work, for me, it pivoted once there was COVID and once the civil unrest and a lot of the protests really emerged. I started in January and this happened in March. So I was working on a plan, and then that quickly changed. And so some of the things that I've been working on right away is really trying to build the staff capacity to understand these questions that we're asking about benefit and burden, and also to get people to not just think about equity in the context of mitigating problems, but to maximize benefits from the start. Because if we only look at equity as, how are we mitigating the problems from our projects, from the start, we're assuming there's going to be problems for those very communities that we should be serving and maximizing benefit for. So if we start from a different framing of providing benefit, that's a total different way of thinking, a total different approach that helps us get to more equitable outcomes. But then also looking at the equitable process. How do you get there? How do you not only improve our community engagement, but make sure that we actually are listening to the community and it's informing our decisions? So the process makes a big difference. And that's also part of why I've been working with our staff to improve their capacity and their approach to the work. It's not just about how many meetings we're having with community members, but it's what did we learn from those meetings, and how did that change our work? How does that change the outcomes? And how can we show that we're being responsive and we're actually meeting the needs? How do we readjust our planning? So I wanted to mention those few things because I think part of what I've tried to prioritize is building the internal capacity, but also trying to come up with strategies to hold us accountable through this work, right? So one of the things that we'll be doing soon, and again, I'm working on a plan for holding us accountable, but we will incorporate an equity section into all of our board reports, right? But that has to be substantive. There has to be a process of tracking and reviewing and making sure it's consistent and we're considering the right things. So, much of my work in this first 10 months has really been setting that baseline of systems and capacity building internally. But I also, I'm really, and it's funny, I was emailing some folks who I think are actually on this webinar, but trying to learn more about what else should we be focusing on in the immediate. There's a lot of opportunities because we're doing things like considering a fairless transit system. We're reimagining public transportation, and I'm a part of. Well, I'm specifically working on the reimagining public safety conversation. But so we're thinking about, okay, from the very start, what does that approach look like? How can we ensure that we are really centering this work in equity? How do we ensure that this is not just us going and talking to the community, but this is really a community-led process that informs the outcomes of our work. What are all these different factors? Bringing in a facilitator that's not a Metro staff person. We really genuinely want to have someone else like leading and kind of making sure everyone's on an equal platform when we're having these conversations, and that there isn't this intimidation factor for some being with Metro and others not having the support that's needed to truly participate. So I feel like this answer is a little, I'm rambling a little bit, but the point is there's a lot to consider in this type of work, especially for such a huge agency. And so I think my challenge is figuring out how do we have an impact at the macro level and the micro level on a project by project basis, but also like at that high level, because I think you have to do both to be successful. So much more to come, but I do look forward to talking. I would love to talk to you, Latifa, and I hope that answers your question, Will.
Well, it was a kind of an unfairly broad question, but I appreciate the answers, especially about sort of building in the foundational institutional baseline of competency and means and methods, and so you're really pioneers in that space. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the question. I think that also cues up nicely our next question.
Yeah, so our next question is from Karina Macias at LADOT.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for elevating my question. So it's obviously a huge undertaking to try to right things that have been so wrong for so long. So definitely want to start there because the question I'm about to ask is pretty massive. So we know that transportation agencies have the power to provide quality and dignified options for all people to participate fully in society, regardless of age, race, ethnicity, and however they come or whether they have a car. We also know that past and present transportation agency actions and decisions have and continue to disrupt, displace, and or disproportionately burden people who are racialized or poor or all of the above and then some. So how might sharing power over agency functions, such as planning, budgeting, or operations, or anything else that your agency undertakes, with the most harmed or burdened people, help the agency reduce harm? Is this power sharing realistic? Is it feasible? Thank you.
I mean, I'll jump in, and I don't have an answer. I have just some thoughts, and I love the question. I mean, no, is it the right thing to do? Absolutely. And has it been easy? And has any agency, including my own, and even my efforts come, have we gotten there? No. I mean, even in elected office, right? Or appointed office, it takes a lot of resource and a lot of flexibility to get there. You know, I'm a single mom. I talked about that with a lot of pride, but I have a nonprofit job where I can work at nights or on the weekends when I have to do transit related stuff. We have boards, like a a police commission like board, and we have a number of task forces that are related to both safety, fair policy, oversight of Measure RR. But again, it's always a question of who can participate, and how do we need to develop and put in the bone marrow of our institutions, not just opportunities for civic participation, but really participatory research opportunities, participatory spaces where actually folks can come and be a part of the planning. I mean, we do what's but by law what's needed to do, but how many meetings take place in the daytime? How many meetings are accessible to real working people? And again, why I think it's so important to be working with institutions like UCLA, and I don't know if Dr. Riggs is on here, but one of my professors and mentors. Yeah, I'm back in MPA school, Jacob, just so you know. Why it's so important for us all to be connected with universities who are thinking about, alongside these institutions, better ways to bring in new voices, better ways to look at new data, better ways to sort of system model after other successful opportunities to both reimagine and implement new equitable systems. But I don't feel like we're there yet. I do feel like it's very difficult for folks who need transit the most to actively participate in our getting our shit together. And we have to figure out how to change that. So I thank you for the question. I mean, again, because I could rattle off and say, we do all of these things. Absolutely, at 100%. And is there so much more we can do? It's the same as for school boards. Every single public sector requires voices from the ground to get it right. And yet we make it so difficult. And even as someone who is trying to move the needle, I am complicit in that. I mean, I'll tell you why. Did I make our meetings nighttime meetings? No, I didn't, right? And I think it's important for folks in leadership positions to talk about and work themselves out of their complicit actions and to take accountability. So as you were talking, I said, I think I have to out myself because again, my nonprofit job makes it so that I can take 2 or 3 hours off every other week and lead a BART board meeting where I know even during COVID, while there's more access and people can call in for public comment, it's still not going to work for the person driving the bus or the person who is cleaning the hotel room or the substitute teacher or the nurse. So thank you for your question, and may it actually push us forward. I appreciate you.
And I thank you for the question as well. I mean, I think, yeah, we're certainly not there at LA Metro. But I don't know, one of the things that when Latifah was speaking, I thought about was the fact that it's important to also get people with lived experiences to create opportunity for them to be in these positions, to be in, whether it's, decision-making positions, the staffing, planning, all those different positions, because that's also one way to impact this change, right? So whether it's, workforce development opportunities, creating more inclusive spaces and culture so that happens, that people's lived experiences can be shared and can help inform the decisions at the staff level too. Because I think sometimes, like I even think about just my own experience growing up and how that informs my work and how that, I mean, my grandfather was a bus driver. I grew up in St. Louis, which was always like growing up and learning about planning, it was always described as this dying city, which always offended me as a person whose family is from that city. But it also fueled my passion for how someone like me needs to be in these seats and helping to make sure that we're planning better and we're recognizing the actual people and their lived experience of our systems, of our land use, et cetera, and trying to figure out how to make it work better for them. And so I think getting more folks with that experience to be in these decision-making positions and creating the space for them to actively participate, not just going through planning and coming into a culture that's kind of the same and, but really being able to be their full selves and bring that experience and expertise into these roles is another way that we can start to get there beyond the necessary community engagement and other solutions, some of which I don't think we have yet. But that's one way.
If I can, I'll quickly add that I don't think sharing the power directly reduces the harm. I'd say that the public process invites the public to participate in a variety of different ways. It could be boards and commissions, it could be public comment, it could be a community engagement event. And, if those are some of the key examples, or some of the tried and true examples of where you would go or how you would participate, even writing letters or making phone calls, even, right? It's not very powerful in nature to just speak to someone whose mind might already be made up, to present them with your life story under 2 minutes during public comment. And so we have to understand the system. Again, we know it, it's not built for us, and nor is it built for that type of dialogue. I think about being a planner and knowing that there's so many different projects and plans that have arbitrary processes, right? We know the objective is community engagement to make informed decisions, but that engagement could look like so many different things. And if the planner isn't you or I, and that planner could be in Kentucky, who's having to create some racial equity plan, who's also maybe white or have a very detached experience from the community that they need to serve, that plan, that engagement process could look like who knows what. And so, on one end, it's great that we have power in our system, in this particular democracy that we have, but it's not the limitation of our power. And oftentimes we indirectly or unconsciously recognize that we have to engage with the system in the non-traditional ways just to be heard, to walk out into the streets and hold a sign, to stop traffic on a freeway, to be heard more effectively than getting in front of a microphone for 2 minutes. And I say this to you as someone who's worked for a former state official, Assemblywoman Bonilla, and has worked for Senator Feinstein doing casework and listening to calls across California about a variety of different issues that are important to that individual, but might not make it to the main stage of the legislature, that might not make it into a form of a bill. And so it's like, how do those people and their needs and concerns also get addressed? The process doesn't allow it to, unless there's a critical mass. And so again, it's the process in which we're supposed to participate in that makes that ineffective. So where we're able to have a lot of control over a budget and over workforce development and over a plan, harness that and call out that you got to call out, point fingers at whoever you got to point fingers at, create actionable steps within your capacity, because when that project or plan is over, it's not policy. It might get adopted by a board or a commission, but it's not legislation. But you want to at least frame it and set it up so that actionable and policy steps are directed to be taken, as opposed to just being like, these are our key recommendations. They're not going to be relevant in 5 years. They might not be relevant once something like COVID hits, so you want to create something and do something with your power that's always able to just, be adaptable and to not, confine yourself to the system.
So on that, we've just scratched the surface, but it's almost 2:45. So I want to give my really sincere thanks to our three panelists, to everybody watching, to everybody who asked questions for this incredible discussion. Thank you to Arup for sponsoring this session. And our next session coming up will be on Friday the 30th at 9:30 a.m. Pacific, and it's going to be a discussion of advancing environmental justice and climate action. But before you go, we're going to have a breakout session sponsored by Farron Peers. So check in the Zoom chat if you're on Zoom for the breakout room link. Once you're at the main room, you can self-select into any room you want. And we'll sort of have a discussion about this session and the whole symposium to date. So you may need to close out of this webinar to go to that one. Thank you so much for coming, and have a good day.